we can see that she's not always faithful, perhaps. Maybe she was unfaithful in going back to, in leaving Bethlehem and going to Moab. She is bitter, as we can see, because the Lord's hand, she believes, was against her, not seeing what else was coming for her. So we're left to wonder how Naomi perceived those gods. And then call me Mara. Mara is the word for bitter in Hebrew. So she just wants to be referred to as bitter. She's not ashamed of that. She's almost proud of that. Call me bitter because the hand of the Lord has been against her. And so she meets back with these women in Bethlehem, and she's back there to rejoin them, and they recognize her, although it's been several years. We're told 10 years at least they were in the land of Moab. And so she's had some hard living in Moab. She's lost her husband, she's lost her 2 sons-in-law, and so she goes back and she wants to be called bitter by these women. But the best thing about chapter 1 is how it ends. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And so you see such a change in tone from the end of verses 20 and 21, where Naomi is saying, call me bitter, the hand of the Lord has been against me, to verse 22, where now we see there's the first glimmer of hope that maybe something good is going to come out of this. So they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So we all know the story of Ruth. Just to run through it quickly, Ruth ends up gleaning in Boaz's field. Naomi tells Ruth, what an incredible coincidence. Boaz happens to be one of our kinsmen. So Naomi says to Ruth, when you're gleaning in his field at the end of the night after Boaz has eaten and drank and he's feeling merry, you go into his tent, find out where he's sleeping, and lay at his feet, and he'll tell you what to do. So Ruth does this. It seems very suggestive, and we're wondering in our culture if that is an invitation for something more than perhaps what they may have meant it for. But to us it seems rather presumptuous. If you go into a man, you think that you're going there for one purpose, but the story doesn't bear that out at all, and Boaz doesn't take it that way. So we're left to think that this was a custom back at the time where this was a way of submission perhaps to your Lord. So Ruth goes in and she lays at Boaz's feet, just as Naomi said. And Naomi said, you just lay there and he will tell you what to do. So Boaz does tell her what to do. She says, what is it I can do for you, my child? And at that point, Ruth says, you are my kinsman redeemer. Please redeem us. So that she makes her wish known. Boaz pledges, of course, to redeem Ruth and Naomi, but there is a catch. There is a nearer kinsman redeemer. And first we have to get past that kinsman redeemer. And if we do, then I'm next in line. So Boaz goes out to the marketplace the next day, as he promises, and he looks for this kinsman redeemer, and lo and behold, the kinsman redeemer walks by, and Boaz grabs him and sits him down and says to him, you can redeem this land, but if you do, you have to redeem Ruth and Naomi as well. And the kinsman redeemer he wanted the land, but when he found that there was a catch, you had to take Ruth and Naomi, then he wasn't interested because he was worried about messing up his own inheritance. He has his own kids. He doesn't want to have to share the inheritance that he has planned for his kids with any potential kids that he might have with Ruth. So that's great news for Boaz. Boaz wanted to marry Ruth, and the first kinsman redeemer passes. So here's Boaz, he's next in line. Ruth and Boaz are married, and Obed is born as a result. Obed is David's grandfather. Obed's son was Jesse. Jesse's son is David. And so the line of David continues on through Ruth. And so it's an amazing story about God's providence, and I would love to be able to explore every detail of that, but there are some things I want to talk about, and I'd like to interact with you about some of these things. And when we think about the story of Ruth, when we think about how sometimes bad things happen to good people in life, but he uses suffering for his own purposes. In my own life, God used suffering very much to draw me to himself. I was not a Christian about 12 years ago, my wife's uncle passed away, and there was a funeral that was a military funeral in style, and it was an emotional time for me. I happened to be under a lot of stress, and his death and the military funeral that happened there was just such an emotional experience. And the pouring rain, where they hand the flag to the wife, and the 21-gun salute, and just incredibly intense emotion at the time. Teenage kids who have just lost their father. Really, really difficult circumstances. And somehow God used that event to take a hard heart like my own and soften it to the point where I was able to see the hope that other people had. There were people in that room in the funeral who had hope that I didn't have. And so there was a tremendous amount of suffering at the time, but God used that suffering for a purpose. Now, his wife, Molly's Uncle Kenny's wife, and the two children, they suffered, and everybody in the room was suffering, but God was still able to make something good out of suffering, and that's an example from my life. And so I wonder, where do you see that in the story? Do you see examples in Ruth chapter 1 of how God used suffering to further his purposes? Can you see that here? Yes?
Put Ruth in a situation where she could know more about God, be surrounded by people who knew the Lord, and get her a situation where she would be provided for, that she would have a husband in the future.
Right. Yep.
You know, kind of, when Chuck talked about this morning in the service, the importance of accountability. I see it was like, you look at Naomi, and she was bitter, but she lost 2 sons.
Right.
So we got to be compassionate with her. But Ruth stood by her as a companion, as a friend. And even though it was a difficult situation, it didn't go up on her own, but was with her and helped Naomi get situated. Which then Naomi in turn was one that kind of brought the kinsman redeemer, the Boaz situation together. So God used that. But really was I see that as the importance of sticking with people and being there for people, having people in our lives that can be like a Ruth to us.
Right.
At a tough time. Because without Ruth, Naomi would have gone back to been bitter. And I don't think that it was really Ruth or Naomi that brought Boaz together with Ruth. So God used that situation.
Right. And if Ruth hadn't gone back, who knows what would have happened to Naomi? She's an older woman, and she doesn't have somebody to provide for her in a patristic society. That would have been very difficult for her. So, yeah. Well, I've told you a story of how suffering worked in my life. Does anybody have a story of their own that they'd like to share about how God used suffering to further his program or to do some good that they'd like to share? Yes.
Well, my wife passed away about, hold on now, I gotta think now, 7 years ago. And he used to draw me closer to himself, to show more things to me, and to refine me in ways I would not have been able to if that hadn't happened. As painful as it was, God used it for the better.
Well, I think one thing we do learn about God is that God does use suffering to further his purposes, and I'm sure we all have examples in our lives of where there was some suffering and we can't understand what it is that we're going through at the time. But when we look back 6 months, a year, a couple of years, whatever it may be, sometimes when we're on the other side of it, we can see that God had his hands in it the entire time. Here's something else I think we learn about God. Adversity can be God's tool for shaping and developing our character and preparing us for future blessings. We see that in the story as Ruth and Naomi are in Moab and they're suffering through difficult circumstances. So how is it that God used adversity in this story to shape his people for future blessing? Yes?
I think it shaped Ruth's faith and her loyalty, and that she left her home and everything she knew and went, to a new land with, a different culture and a different religious structure than she had grown up with. So it showed that she had a tremendous amount of faith.
Yeah, that is interesting. And we're going to talk about what kind of faith Ruth had a little bit later on. She's a Moabitess, of course, and she's from a pagan land. And so I want to talk about that, whether she had faith in God, whether she had faith in Naomi, or what it was about Ruth that made her decide to go back with, about Ruth that made her go back with Naomi. So we'll get to that. I think that during this time, you had a time period where Ruth spent a lot of time with Naomi, and obviously they had been through adversity together. They had suffered together. And so I think suffering together draws people close as well. When you've experienced the same hardship together, you have a bond there that's not easily broken. And so maybe that's part of what's going on here too. Is there a time in your life where God used adversity to shape your character, to prepare you for future blessings? I want you to think about that a second, and I want to tell you another personal story. About 7 years ago, I had a close friend who was diagnosed with leukemia, and he lived about 6 months with leukemia, and then he passed away. And he had 4 kids and a wife, and young kids. The kids were about the same age as ours at the time. They probably ranged from 8 down to 2, something like that. 4 different kids, and that was a very, very emotional time. You sit there looking at this. You're looking at these 4 little kids, and you're looking at the wife who's now a widow at about 40 years old, something like that, and you just wonder, where is God in this?